Thank you, Joe. All right, well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. And excuse me for 1 second while I grab this. Of course, I don't have my readers, so I don't know why I bother to put out notes anyway. Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to look out and see so many faces I know and other people I've heard about, and now it's clear why I can never get into Leadership Gainesville. But I appreciate you guys having me, and Gladys, Joe's mom, actually told me earlier tonight that she had read some of my books. I tried to explain to her what I will tell all of you now. I don't care if you read them as long as you buy them. So anyway, thank you, though, for doing both. So I'll talk a little bit about this as background, talk a little bit about myself. It's my favorite topic. And unfortunately, I see that there is something else on the agenda besides me, so I will keep my remarks relatively short. But I'll talk about my background a little bit and then tie that into leadership, all of which I have a feeling you guys know, given your role in the community and what you guys do and do for others. Just want to make sure, can you guys hear me all the way to the back? Can you hear me now? No? Okay. All right, so I'll stick with this. So I moved here when I was 3. We came here just so Dad could be a part of that Leadership Gainesville 10. No. He attended UF Law School, and we've been here ever since. And I grew up desperately wanting to go to the University of Florida. I did everything I could that I thought would help me. I went to Eastside. My wife went to Buchholz. I have yet to forgive her. But I went to Eastside and was part of the first IB program. Somebody asked me the other day what the application process was like, that their child was going through it and all this, and they said, you know, what was it like back in the day? And I said, well, they grabbed us in middle school, and they brought us into the lunchroom. I already had my entire schedule from Gainesville High School. I was taking biology and whatever. We were all set and ready to go, and they brought us into the lunchroom, and they checked and made sure that we had a pulse, and they said, why don't you try this? So that was the extent of the process, and I spent 4 years at Eastside and thought, great, I'm going to go to Florida, and I was wanting to play sports, wanting to play baseball and football. Florida, the problem, though, they had a very stringent rule at the time as respect to student athletes, and it was one that tripped me up. They required athletic ability. So I went off to Duke. You know, that joke used to really work, but given that Duke went to a bowl game last year, I'll just leave it at that. I actually just came back from Athens, where the Duke baseball team, which Joe did not mention. I usually just tell people I played ball at Duke, and given that I'm tall and thin, I try to get away with whatever I can. But I played baseball there and was a part of a team that went 10-37, which is, when you do the math, not good. And so I actually came back from Athens yesterday, where Duke won the regional, first NCAA victory in a regional since Joe McCarthy was having his hearings, which is a while ago. So we won. We knocked Georgia out. You're welcome. And so we went on to, so anyway, came back and actually caught last night's game. So too much baseball. But anyway, I really wanted to go to Florida, desperate to go to Florida. Instead, went off to law school, as Joe said, and did that after playing for Coach Spurrier. And along the way between law school and Coach Spurrier, I started to get my first taste of leadership. As an aside, Coach Spurrier said that there are only 2 rules that he had for us as a team. And the 2 rules were, one was to not embarrass yourself, your family, or Duke University. And rule number 2 was not to wear hats inside. And the second rule was the one that seemed to trip up some of us. The best story about that was that one of my teammates, an offensive lineman from the hills of North Carolina, was actually on a recruiting trip. He brought some recruits in, and they sent them all to the basketball game. So Duke was playing basketball against somebody. And so Anthony took his recruits to the game, and so he's there. Well, Spurrier spots him from across the arena, and Anthony's got a hat on. So Steve calls him in the next day and says, Anthony, you're going to have to run. I saw you wearing a hat inside. And Anthony said, Coach, there's no way that counts. I'm at a basketball game. There's no way that's wearing a hat inside. And Steve said, Anthony, it's even called Cameron Indoor Stadium. So Anthony was running the next morning at 5 a.m. But a side note, and this is not the main topic that I was going to speak about, but given that the rest of what I have to say is brilliant and you'll get your money's worth there, think of this as a bonus. You're actually making money off of what I give you in the next 30 seconds here. And that is the difference between rules and standards. And that I think as we build organizations and we think about leadership and sustainable leadership, what I've seen over and over, and there are probably exceptions to this, as I'm sure there are, but to the extent we can use standards instead of rules, it helps us build a sustainable culture. When, as an example, I think Coach Spurrier's obviously the rule, the hat was a rule. The not embarrassing yourself was more of a standard. Coach Dungy did that when he came to the Buccaneers. And he first started off, he felt like he needed rules in place to get things started, and he told the guys, don't be out after one. If you're out after one and something happens, I'm going to presume that you were the one at fault. So if you want to be out after one, the risk is all on you. And after a couple of years of that, it changed to, he wanted them to understand what he was trying to do, and so it changed to a standard of, try not to put yourself in situations with the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong place. And it no longer mattered necessarily if it was 12:59 or 11:05 or 1:05 or whatever. Just be careful and think about that. And I think as we grow our organizations and try to build organizations that can live beyond us, to the extent we can help others around us understand what we're trying to get at and why, helps us with that sustainability. So that's your extra bonus material. Now, back to the regularly scheduled program. And that is that I went off to law school. Again, the regular scheduled program is about me. So I went to law school, spent a couple years there, 3 years there actually. My dad had practiced law, and a lot of you know him. I'm the one who stays off by myself in the corner. He's the one who makes sure he knows everybody in every room. But he practiced law, and I wanted no part of that. Only went to law school because the LSAT went really well, and I couldn't figure out what else to do with an English degree. So I got out of law school and ended up practicing law for 4 years, 2 years with a federal judge, and then 2 years with a really big firm. And the federal judge, and this will help you understand just what I've been trying to overcome for all these years. The federal judge was appointed by Nixon, and my dad clerked for him in the 70s, and then Judge Hodges was still on the bench when I came along in the 90s. So Judge Hodges hired me, pretty much no interview, because he had watched me grow up. And Judge Hodges got a letter shortly after I started from Chief Justice Rehnquist. And the Chief Justice said, Dear Terry, for EEOC purposes, please explain why you didn't have an open hiring process and hired a white male without conducting any interviews. A not unfair question. And Judge Hodges said, wrote a note back and said, Bill, thank you for your note. I have known Mr. Whitaker since he was a young boy. I watched him attend Duke University and then Harvard Law School. He graduated with honors from both. Obviously, someone needed to complete his education. Given that I have 2 degrees from the University of Florida, I am that person, so I hired him. Sincerely yours, Terry. I have the letter still. So I finally got a master's a few years ago from UF. It was in entrepreneurship, small businesses, and I explained to my wife how it was critical that I have these skills, and Amy said, you've picked the shortest program that finally makes you a Gator, haven't you? So I am finally a Gator. And through all this, I've been able to learn leadership. I've been able to see different things in action. I saw a variety of coaches when I was in the league. In addition to Coach Spurrier then, I worked for the Jaguars where I saw Tom Coughlin. And then I was there with John Gruden with the Buccaneers after being with Tony Dungy in between. So it was I had a little bit of whiplash going from Coughlin to Dungy to Gruden, but learned a lot along the way. And in fact, the year I was there with Tony really was a launching pad for the rest of my career and what I'm doing now. And I saw Tony in action in what was a really pretty challenging year. Tony tells everybody we worked together for 2 years, but I remind Tony that it was just one really, really ridiculously long year. And we ended up, for those of you, anybody not follow football? Anybody just say, okay, great. So every story I've got is about football. So I'm going to apologize in advance. It is what it is. So we won 3 of our first 7 games to start the year with the Buccaneers. And Tony there were rumors about him being fired. And back then, the St. Pete Times and the Tampa Trib hadn't merged yet. So we were getting it from both sides of the bay, the articles every day, every week about, will Tony be fired? And leaving the game plan is a sign of panic, and panic is not in our game plan. And it sounds trite, but Tony said, look, there are certain things we do. Our game plan is this. This is who we are. We're still going to go into the schools, and we're still going to have these visits, and we're still going to do these things. We're still going to play offense the way we play it, which wasn't very well, which is half the reason we all got fired. But anyway, and we're still going to play defense the way we do that, and we're going to do things the way we do them. And sure enough, he righted the ship, and by the end of the year, we were back in the playoffs and played the Eagles, and everything was good, and we lost to the Eagles, and Tony was fired. And so then the next year, Gruden came in, and we won the Super Bowl, and that's when I got a ring that's too big for my little, I used to say I have 8th grade girl hands, but I now have an 8th grade girl in the house, and it's not fair to her. So, so anyway, that's when I got my Super Bowl ring, and then the next year I was fired. And so, so it was life in the NFL. And so I thought, well, I've seen some different things and a variety of different experiences, and maybe I had an offer to go to the Seahawks and the Falcons and the Bears and had a chance to stay in the league, and thought instead that maybe Tony's story could help some people. So I hatched this idea that I would write a book about Coach Dungy, and so we were actually planning on, we had another job offer out of the league in Naples and looking for houses, and it's too bad because it turned out we could buy like half a bedroom house for what we were paying for our house in Tampa down in Naples. But we took our house off the market in Tampa because I told Amy that I had this vision that I would write a book about Tony and it would help lots of people and it would be great. And Amy said, that's fantastic. What a great concept. And my mom's here and she'll tell you that I'm educated far beyond my intelligence. And what I did at that point was fly to Indianapolis and tell Tony my great idea. And Tony said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't want a book about me. Nobody wants to hear about me. I've got nothing to share. I don't think that this makes any sense. And so I was unemployed for 3 years. And I unofficially, I think I was on the watch lists at Duke and Harvard to pull my degrees if I didn't get my act figured out quickly. I instead worked in ministry, as Joe mentioned. The church, our local church, it was really just a mercy hiring. They put me in charge of men's and women's ministry, small groups, Bible study stuff. They asked me if I would just run those completely into the ground, which I was able to accomplish with flying colors. In fact, so I was pitching this idea to Tony. His son died along the way, as many of you may have followed the story and know. And then they won the Super Bowl, and at that point, Tony thought maybe people did want to hear his story. And maybe there would be a market for it, and he wouldn't end up with a garage full of books that had his face on it, which is what he thought the process would be. And so he called me, and I was actually at a staff meeting for our church, and we had gone out to lunch, and I excused myself because I saw Tony was calling, and took the call, and Tony said, hey, I've decided I'm going to do the book, and let's go, and and we were going to be on a really tight time frame, and so I walked back in, and I told our senior pastor, I said to Matthew, I said, hey, I've got this book to do with Tony, and I'll give you at least 2 weeks, and then however long. And he said, no, please, just go now. So that was the end of that. And my story is a recurring theme of unable to hold a job, which is what they'll call it if and when I finally do. It'll be more of a pamphlet than a book. But anyway, so I decided I was going to do this book, and so Tony decided he was going to do this book. So we ended up writing it in 30 days, and actually in 24 days, and not to brag, well, but yes. Anyway, so we did it in 24 days, and we did it very quickly so it would come out before the season started, because we wanted to get it out so Tony could promote it, and then anyway, the season would start and the like. So the book came out, and one of the things they told us was to expect that the book would never hit the New York Times bestseller list, that for some reason this will surprise you. For some reason, football fans not only don't buy books, turns out they don't read. So they said, just understand this probably won't do very well and the like. So it opened up at number 2. It went to number 1 and spent 26 weeks, which by, again, my limited math is about half the year, in the top 10. And so it was just this amazing run. So I found myself speaking shortly thereafter. I was talking to a group in Boston, and it was fantastic. It was a fantastic talk. Not as good as what you're getting, but still fantastic nonetheless. And a buddy came up to me afterwards, a law school friend, and he said, because I talked on how success, hard work and keeping your nose to the grindstone and commit your actions to the Lord and your plans will succeed was Tony Dungy's life verse. And I said, that verse doesn't speak to timing, so you may be unemployed for 3 years, but if you commit your actions and do it for the right reasons. And he said, man, that was so great. I loved it. Everything about it, everything was spot on, except for just your main premise was totally wrong. And as he spoke, he said, look, I watched you for 3 years follow what you thought you were supposed to do. You followed the call on your life. You did what you were supposed to do. And to get wrapped up in whether or not the book hit number 1, whether or not people bought it, whether or not, that's not what we're called to do. And he's right. And I think that ties into into what I learned in the next book we did. Tony Dungy and I did another book then. Well, we've done several since then, but one of the ones we did, Tony is really the Nathan Whitaker Full Employment Act. We do another book all the time. We've got a teamwork book coming out here this next winter. Look for that in your local bookstores. Again, I don't care if you read it. No, just kidding, as long as you buy it. But we've got another book coming out. But one of the books we did was called The Mentor Leader. And it was a leadership book, and I really enjoyed getting to do that, and so I was able to use some of these principles of leadership that I had seen and had seen exhibited by Tony. And one of the things that Tony said, though, he was very concerned, and he said, look, I haven't done any research. I'm not coming to this from the standpoint of all these people have done all this leadership research, and they really know what they're talking about. I'm just a guy who, wears a pair of shorts and a whistle and just kind of been muddling through this. And I told him I thought that was part of the power that he brought to it, that he had been out kind of in the trenches and seen it exhibited every week and had it tested every week. And so we had a bunch of real life applications. And so Tony said, he said, okay, he'd do it, but we decided that I would do some research along the way to make sure we weren't totally off base. One of the things I learned that won't surprise you all, but surprised me a little bit in talking to a friend who does leadership research and consulting and the like, was that the finding that in times of crisis, people gravitate towards leaders of character. That they don't worry about the person who's the smartest or necessarily the leader who's their boss, but in times of crisis, they look for character and the person who's trustworthy, the person who's shown they're in their corner. And so character is critical in leadership. And Tony had this sense of, it's good not to lie and it's good to be honest, and he always tried to be forthright and a person of integrity, but to have it borne out by the research was helpful. And one of Tony's stories about that I thought was so telling that happened to him along the way was in the 1984 playoffs. He was the defensive coordinator of the Pittsburgh Steelers, the youngest defensive coordinator in NFL history, I think. And so he's there with the Steelers, and everybody already knew him, good guy, and had been coaching for a while under Coach Noll. And they're playing the Broncos, and the Broncos were 13-3. The Steelers were 9-7. The Broncos were heavily favored. They're playing in Mile High in Denver. And for those of you who are aware of this, the media and the NFL, as you may have seen at different times, have this kind of uneasy relationship. And the league needs interest. They need the media, but then coaches can get kind of nervous about people watching practice or doing whatever. So there's this policy the league has where the first part of practice is open, as they call it, and then after that it's closed. So during the open part of practice, the media sets up their cameras and they do their live shots or they do their recorded stuff or whatever, but they watch practice. And then at the end of that period, then the PR director comes over and says, okay, practice is now closed, so they got to take the cameras down and they can't report anything else they may see. So everything you've heard about Tom Brady, had his arm in a sling or whatever, came from the open part of practice, but all the plays and things that happen later in practice, they can't talk about. Fine, so everybody understands that and knows it. Well, Tony gets a call from a reporter that he had known, and the reporter called and said, hey, Tony, just really excited about you coming out to Denver and seeing us, and you're just such a good guy, and I always love running into you, and I ran across something I thought you should know. And Tony couldn't figure out what in the world this guy could possibly think that he needed to know, but okay. And the guy said, yeah, Denver's practicing a halfback option pass. It's a trick play. They ran it in practice. And Tony said, oh, you can't tell me this. There's no way I should know this. You can't. And the guy said, you're just such a good guy. I just wanted you to have every advantage. So Tony's completely thrown. What does he do, right? The Steelers write his checks. People are relying on him. The players are relying on him. But at the same time, he's now got information that he never should have had. And so Tony's trying to decide what to do, and he wrestles with it for a couple of days, and he ends up deciding to sit on it. So he's in the box. He doesn't tell a soul. He's in the coach's box watching the game. Late in the second quarter, sure enough, John Elway pitches. The running back throws it, a wobbly pass, completed for 52 yards. And but for it being a wobbly pass, the guy would have scored. He's tracked down, caught just short of the goal line. Next play, Elway throws an interception. Tony had gone from sick to his stomach to thinking, wow, God saved me there. But the reality is that God won't always save us, right? Sometimes our actions in doing the right thing will have short-term implications and short-term ramifications. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes it'll all come out all right. But if we keep that long-term focus and understand that living lives of character and doing the right thing is really what matters at the end of the day. And Tony kept that focus. Checking my time, sorry. Again, you guys just cut me off when you want me to be done, but I'm happy to talk about myself forever. So again, but let me talk, so the next thought though is about character, and I think we can fall into the trap of living a life of character or thinking it's important to be a person of character so that we can be an effective leader. But I don't think that can be our focus. I don't think the fact that we want to be a leader should be the goal. I think at the end of the day, the why we're leading is why it matters. And I think for most of us, that's the thought of significance or a legacy, this idea of being successful, selling a lot of books, that's all nice and that's sweet and that pays the mortgages and that's great. But at the end of the day, I think we're called to more than that we're called to living a life of legacy and significance. Tony had another experience when he was coaching the Colts. He had moved on from the Broncos to from the Steelers to the Bucs to the Colts, and so now he's in Indianapolis at the time of this story, and he was getting ready to play the New England Patriots. And it was the middle of the season, and they kept matching up in the playoffs, and New England and Indianapolis kept playing. And so this was dubbed as the game of the century, and those of you who follow sports know that there's about 11 games of the century every 3 years. And so this was the most recent game of the century. Both the Colts and the Patriots were undefeated, and the ramifications were actually really large because the thought was whoever won this midseason game would probably have home field advantage in the playoffs, and so it meant would Indianapolis be hosting New England to play in the Dome in Indy in 70-degree weather on the turf in January, or would they be outside in Foxborough, Massachusetts with a bunch of crazy Patriots fans and some snow and whatever else? And so Wednesday rolled around and during game week, and everybody can, all the media are in, they're all talking about this, and Tony had an obligation. He had committed earlier in the year that he was going to do a public service address announcement for a place called The Villages in Indianapolis, and it's an adoption agency. And so he had told them, I'll do this PSA spot for you, and I'll do this. Well, it happened to fall on that Wednesday during the week. And Tony had time to do it, and that wasn't the issue. And his only challenge was, though, what would the perception be? That he was sure that Bill Belichick wasn't going to be spending any time doing public service address announcements during that week and getting his players ready at every given hour. But Tony knew that he had this free time, but Tony thought, if we lose and if we don't have home field and somebody finds out, then maybe that's going to be an issue. And so Tony actually wrestled with it for a bit, and then Tony said to me, and this is verbatim, I'd love to take credit for this language, but I just wrote down what he said, which is pretty much how I do all the books. Tony said, if you start making excuses to cut out the things, actually I'm going to have to have you hold it so I can see it. If you start making excuses to cut out the things that are important because of exigent circumstances, it will become a habit, and you'll start cutting them out regularly. And Tony looked at himself in the mirror and decided, you know what, this is what I'm going to do. This is who I am, and if somebody doesn't like it, well, that's fine. So he went and did the PSA, and it didn't cut into his time getting ready. And sure enough, Sunday rolled around, and sure enough, they lost in a close game. And Tony, the season rolled through the way everybody thought it would. They went up to Foxborough. They got beat in the snow and the cold. And Tony said, you know what, sometimes these things happen. And sometimes you have short-term, and I'm not sure that was linked to this anyway, but sometimes you open yourself up to this criticism and these perceptions and the like. But it is what it is. If your focus is on the legacy, if your focus is on significance, the reality, of course, as you guys all know, is that we, like it or not, we're all leaving a legacy. The question isn't whether or not we are. The question is it positive or is it really positive, and whether we're doing the right things and building into people's lives. And so Tony said, totally the right decision, totally glad I did it, even if it didn't pay off and even if maybe it had ramifications. I spoke to the Miami Dolphins a couple of years ago, and the week before I got there, they had done this really cool exercise where they had to write 5 thank yous to people who had impacted their lives along the way. And so it was, at first they were kind of grumbling about it, I was told, and then they ended up really liking it, and they wrote these notes. And so when I got there, I was really curious to follow up on it. And so before I started, I asked them, I said, just curious about the thank you notes and who you wrote to, And I said, being a Florida kid and growing up here, I've seen Don Shula over the years and the winningest coach in NFL history, really put the Dolphins on the map. Still an amazing icon in Miami for all he does for the community and what he does. And of course, we've got a Shula's Steakhouse here in town, as do many communities. And so I said, okay, I can only assume that given that you guys are Miami Dolphins, that all of you guys wrote one of your thank yous to Don Shula. Not surprisingly, no hands went up. I said, okay, I get it. That's because he's a coach. You guys are players. So Dan Marino or some of those guys, Nat Moore, you guys probably wrote to former Dolphins players. No hands went up. I said, all right, let me try this one more time. How many of you guys had a poster of Michael Jordan on your wall when you were kids? Half the hands went up. There you go. So Jordan poster. And I said, okay, great work ethic. Really taught us to never say die. Tried different things. Cut from his team in high school. So many positive lessons to learn from Jordan, other than him being a Carolina Tar Heel. Really a good guy. And so I said, okay, how many of you guys wrote one of your thank yous to Jordan? Nobody had. And the reality was, as you know where I'm going with this, they wrote to fathers and mothers. They wrote to coaches. They wrote to teachers and uncles and people who lived down the street. And they didn't write to the people who were on TV on Sunday, and they didn't write to the people that we think are famous, and someday when I get there, then I can do something for somebody. They wrote to the people that are just like us, or at least just like me. And so it was just another lesson in that reminder of who we're building into the lives of and how and why. One final story on this point before I let you go. And again, you can see that I really think highly of Tony and the like. But yet another Tony story. We had just come out with Quiet Strength. He was back to coaching the Colts. And this may stun you guys, but fans want to give their opinion on who should be playing or what play you should be running and the like. So we would get crazy letters with diagrams or calls into the office. Hey, you got to talk to me. I've really got the offense figured out. And so coaches sometimes, don't return all these calls, right? And so his assistant was his gatekeeper for some of this. And so a call came through, and his assistant said, Tony, I really think you need to call this guy back. And so Tony called, and it was a father. And the father was concerned about his son. And given that Tony's son had taken his own life, the father said, I just wanted to reach out to you as kind of one father to another, that my son was supposed to be married, and the fiance called off the wedding for no reason, and my son is in this downward spiral, and he seems, just very upset, very distraught, and I'm really worried about him. And Tony said, I'm happy to talk to him. I have no idea what to say, but I'm happy to just be a listening ear and chat with him. And the father said, if you would do that, I would appreciate it. And so Tony called the young man, and they chatted. And they chatted several times, chatted one day, and Tony said, I'm going to call you back in a couple days. And so they talked again a couple days later, and then Tony would say, I'm going to call again in 3 or 4 days. And so they spoke over time and just talked about life and talked about kind of what mattered and things like that. And Tony talked about the fact that, as he aged, there would be perspective in this sense that, this too will pass. And so they spoke over a period of weeks, and the young man was also getting some counseling, talking to some other folks. And then over time, he told Tony one day, he said, I really appreciate all that you've done for me, and I'm finally seeing a ray of hope that the wedding date has passed, and finally I feel like I'm pulling out of this and can see kind of hope for the future. And he said, but by the way, Tony, I keep forgetting to ask you, and I've been meaning to ask for the longest time, what do you do? And Tony said, I'm a football coach. And the young man said, that is so cool. High school or college? And the reality is that he's on the phone with the defending Super Bowl champion coach of the Colts, and he didn't care, right? That as Napoleon Hill said, that people don't care how, well, I forget it. I don't know what Napoleon Hill said, but people they care that you care about them, right? They don't care how smart you are. They don't care how great you are. They care that you care about them. And they don't care your title, and they don't care your position, and the like. And I think that really needs to imbibe itself in it needs to infuse itself in how we conduct ourselves as leaders. That it can't be enough to merely want to win, want to succeed. Those things are important. But it's got to be with a sense of, why am I doing this? Why is my organization, why does it matter if this organization is around in 5 years or 10 years? Are we doing any good? Are we building into people's lives? And if so, what and why? And why does this all matter? Tony's last day on the job with the Colts, he had been toying with the idea of retiring for quite a while. And he couldn't decide if he should or not. And finally one year he decided, this is it, enough is enough, and I'm going to move on. And so they had scheduled a press conference, and he's getting ready to walk down the hall, and he tells his administrative assistant, I'll be back in a minute, I'm going to go down to the press conference. And she says, hold on. And she had just opened a letter, and she handed it to him, and he said, I'll see you when I get back. I don't have time. And she said, actually, I think you do have time. And he had learned over the years to listen to her. And so he stopped and started reading the letter. And so on his final day at work, as he's getting ready to walk off down the hall, he opens the letter, and the letter said, Coach Dungy, we are not football fans, and we don't really follow the Colts, but we do live in the Indianapolis area. And several months ago, or actually about a year and a half ago, we were watching television, and it was late night TV after a Colts game, and an ad came on for the Villages. And we were watching this ad, and we were hearing you speak. And today, we have a 12-year-old son who lives in our home who had never had a Little League practice to go to. He'd never had a bed he'd slept in that was his own. And we have a family now because you took the time to do that spot with the Villages. And Tony looked at the letter and thought, that's exactly it. The legacy and why we do what we do. And the reality is that most of us don't get the letter, right? Most of us don't get that moment and don't get that pat on the back. But I think we have to press on in faith that what we're doing and the legacy we're leaving is just as real whether or not we see examples or not. So I thank you for your time, and God bless you, and thanks for all that you do for Gainesville and the community.